Today on the Dolby Institute podcast, we talk about the new Netflix series Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, nominated for an amazing 7 Primetime Emmy Awards.
The genre is squarely within a horror sci-fi, mode. And it is about what we don't see in life. That's what makes shooting horror films or thrillers so interesting, is that we allow the audience to only see what we want them to see and tease the rest of it into the blacks.
On the podcast today, we're joined by the series showrunner and executive producer Miles Dale, and 2 of the recipients of those Emmy nominations, cinematographer Anastas Michos, who goes by Toss, as well as sound supervisor Nelson Ferreira. Now, the last time Nelson was on our show was way back on episode number 32 to talk about his Oscar nomination for The Shape of Water. So it was great to have him back again to discuss another nomination for another collaboration with Guillermo del Toro. Our conversation today focuses on episode 3 of the series, The Autopsy, and we get into a lot of spoilers. So if you haven't seen the episode yet, I encourage you to hit pause, go over to Netflix, where Cabinet of Curiosities is streaming right now in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, and give it a look. I started the conversation by talking with showrunner Miles Dale about the anthology format. In the 80s and 90s, it was pretty conventional wisdom that anthology series didn't work because audiences needed consistent characters to get emotionally invested in. But we seem to be in a new golden age of anthology series right now. And I asked Miles why he thought the format and this series were finding success.
Well, I think it's a few things. A short attention span might be one of them. But I think that, people just like good storytelling. And while it is a little bit of a risk to do something where there isn't a cliffhanger that makes you tune in next week or, skip intro in 5 seconds, a broad a base of things that are sort of tonally consistent seemed likely to find an audience and was a fun playground for us. Guillermo and I, both being children of the 60s, grew up on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, many of those kinds of shows. And we wanted to do something like that, and we felt that there was an audience for it. There aren't that many of those shows around. You've got Black Mirror, which, has that sort of tech gone bad thread that holds it together that, maybe speaks to a more specific audience. But for us, it was just a question of a medium that we loved, that we thought was underrepresented, some stories that Guillermo in particular had wanted to tell for a while, and it was kind of the only way to do it. So, we and Netflix felt it would it'd be kind of a worthwhile risk to do. And that was really the impetus for us. And I think, in the feedback that we've had, everyone could get to episode 2 or 3 or 4, or if they get to one that didn't particularly hit them, they can either skip around or drop it. But, we found that wasn't the case and that most people actually did stay with the show.
I was really fascinated by the way this episode's structured. Rather than just going chronologically, we start with the explosion in the coal mine, and then we jump forward to the really in-depth, intense conversation between Craven and Winters, and then we start jumping back and forth in time. And I was really kind of curious about how you guys arrived at the structure. One of the things I noticed was I was never lost for a second. I really, you guys were able to keep me tracked all the way through. So was that something that was in the original short story? Did it come through the writing process, and how did you arrive at the structure of the piece?
It really came in the writing process, frankly. We wanted to do something that struck a balance between us not getting ahead of the audience, but also unpeeling the onion in such a way that, we can tease with the one thing and then fill in the blanks later as Winters and the sheriff are unspooling it. So we actually played with it. It was originally a little less, then it was a little more, and then we found kind of this sweet spot where we felt it was really going to give the show great energy to, show the audience some and then come back and fill in those blanks. So it was kind of one of the only, really maybe the only episode where we used that kind of a structure, and we were really kind of jazzed when we found the magic, spot with the storytelling.
Yeah, it works so well. I was really mesmerized by the opening of the show. This very powerful image of the spider web, and then the image of the spider that we keep coming back to through the show. Then the spider web becomes the nighttime star field, and then that becomes the wall of the mine, the rock walls of that mine. Nelson, tell us a little bit about the sound design for that opening part and the mix and how you guided us through the opening into that first sequence.
I adore this episode, and I love the opening of this episode. And it wasn't really fleshed out until a little bit later, when we did see it, it appeared like almost deceivingly simple, as it's just really a couple of transitions, right? Like from the web, as you said, to the star field, and then to the rock face. And yet the sequence of the images, they sort of say, they say so much on their own, as well as in context with the theme of the story, right? Like sort of going full circle to the end of the story. Like the spider web is kind of small and delicate, and it's evocative, like of hunter and prey, which kind of ties in with the traveler. Yet it's so complex and symbolic of the cosmos, right? And then boom, you go, this hands us off to the star field, which it's like rotating gently, and you would think quietly in the universe, but it's accompanied by the sound of this ominous kind of metal clockwork, right? And then that carries us to the glistening rock face at the bottom of the mine shaft. And we're like, of course, this is mining material, right? And it takes us into the regular storytelling. So it was, I don't know, I mean, like really poetic, almost like a 2001 approach, to doing sound. And like we were all over it, obviously. And when the web then like reappears after the mine shaft explosion, it launches us beautifully like into the storytelling of the episode, right?
Toss, for you and Nelson both, I'd love to hear about your initial conversations with the director, David Pryor, about that opening sequence, about how what did you need to do to set the right tone visually and orally for the show?
Of course, tone is everything. I mean, David and I watched The Deer Hunter because it's squarely in the 70s, and it's a favorite film of ours, and it's an Appalachian sort of feel to the whole thing. But the interesting thing about tone is that spider web was a serendipitous catch. David and I had gone with just a camera and a van to grab some second unit stuff of a river going by. And in fact, it was so serendipitous that I had taken the tire off the van to use as set dressing with a couple of crushed Coke cans in there to really set the fact that this was an industrial. David spots the spider web and says, shoot the web. I go, oh, I don't have enough backlight. Here's a water bottle. Let me sprinkle it on this web. And out of that kind of imagery, and which is the best thing about what we do, which is the spontaneous creation of images, as well as the pre-vision ones, that led to that whole tonality in editorial of where we were going with the whole thing. The morph between the star field and the face of the anthracite rock was always in the script, but the spider stuff was just grabbed.
You really embraced contrast and darkness in this show, not only to set up the mood, but I think to effectively hide things from the viewer. How did you tell me about the decision process of using darkness, and how did you know how far to go? And how far was too much? And I'm curious about Dolby Vision. The Dolby Vision version of this looks spectacular, and there's so much detail in those blacks. So tell me about your use of darkness in the show.
Well, I mean, the genre is squarely within a horror sci-fi, mode. And it is about what we don't see in life. That's what makes shooting horror films or thrillers so interesting, is that we allow the audience to only see what we want them to see and tease the rest of it into the blacks. Although at the same time, it is television, and what I didn't want to do, and neither did David, was put it so deep that you might possibly do in a feature because, nobody knows where home TVs are set these days. And so we're always struggling against that. So I think it was a strong balance in the DI. I mean, obviously the negative, quote unquote, was there. And it was a balance in the DI to try and bring out those details, which worked quite well. And what made it a noir feel was the contrast of color as much as anything else. I mean, although set in the 70s in Appalachia, there's certain scenes that David and I really wanted to be saturated, and in order to contrast, for example, the first discovery of the orb in the upstairs room versus the explosion in the mine and the darkness there. It was the question of contrasting the colors of the incandescent lights that were in the mine versus the starfield before. So that's kind of where I was going with the whole thing, is if I couldn't get it into the darkness, I'd pull it out and I'd give that contrast in color.
Are you able to participate in the DI process and the finishing and the vision grade, or are you already several shows down the pike at that point?
No, I'm several shows down the pike, but Miles and the entire production team really embraced the work and the art of the cinematographer, which is, from beginning to end, having ownership and collective vision of the actual image. And because of COVID and because of, traveling restrictions and whatnot, I timed that in my bathroom in New York City because it was the only room that had no windows. And I sat in my bathtub with an iPad with our color dimer and did a couple of passes. So yes, there was a fond memory of in a darkened room on an iPad Pro, which are now color graded so that they're pretty much universal, no matter where we see them.
Were you working in Dolby Vision on your iPad Pro, or was that an SDR grade?
No. That was an SDR grade. And normally what happens is, normally we do an SDR grade first and then go to Dolby Vision because otherwise it slows down the process.
Tell me about creating the look and the sound of the orb. Tosh, you brought up the orb, and I wanted to ask you about that. I made a note to myself when I was watching that opening sequence and what I thought was the bomb showed up in the mine. And I just wrote a note to myself, what am I hearing here? So tell me about the orb and how you approached Nelson, you for the sound design, and Taz the visuals of the orb.
The orb was presented to us as I guess it was called an intelligent vessel. We were just basically given that lead and to run with it. David was very good that way in terms of providing just an outline and kind of letting us go and I don't know, wander our way there, I guess I'll call it. But earlier in the mine explosion, I think what we're hearing, I mean, it's sort of more alert, and I think we're hearing power surges, beeps. And what's really cool about that one is it's sort of an animal growl that's been metallicized to sort of give it so it still has that menace, but in a sort of, futuristic context. We'll call it.
Taz, I wanted to ask you about shooting that opening mine sequence. That's such a it was such a visceral experience. Was that a soundstage, or was that a practical location, or what was your approach to shooting that sequence?
It was. I mean, Tomorrow's just an amazing production designer. So that kind of collaboration is just so wonderful to just be a part of. It was actually, if Miles will correct me, an abandoned power plant that was a stage that we used as a stage. And she fashioned not long, maybe 10 or 15 meters, 30, 35 feet worth of actual mine out of styrofoam with certain sections that were set pieces that were anthracite and coal. And the rest of it was extended into a abandoned power plant. So that was a little difficult for camera because we had to shoot in a confined space with time restrictions that we all have in television or in features. But we did have breakaway walls that we could hide cameras in and whatnot. And our key grip, Robert, did an amazing job of getting a technocrane somehow into that space and making that work. And then also she fashioned this elevator, and the elevator is supposed to plummet 10 stories, but by virtue of it being a stage, it only actually traveled 10 feet. So that's all smoke and mirrors and lights and little lighting gags to make that sort of whole elevator journey work at the beginning of that sequence.
I'm really glad that you guys brought up the production design because that makeshift morgue set was just so. It was so amazing to me, Nelson, how your team brought that set to life through sound. Taz, the use of color and contrast and darkness in the makeshift morgue was just amazing to me. To me, that's an example of all the departments on a show coming together and playing their A game. So I'd love for you to talk about the design aesthetic of that morgue, kind of what you did tonally with that space. And then Nelson, how you brought that to life with some really interesting ambience work in there, I thought.
One of the first things that struck me about the script is as soon as Murray enters the morgue and turns on a light, the lights don't change. I mean, it is a working place. So it was a question of how to keep the interest of the audience through, I can't remember how many pages of what we did there, but it's certainly the entire last act. And still be able to move camera and still give the scene the suspense and the intent that we needed. So again, we had this amazing set that was just beautiful to light, but part of the challenge was once they walked in, the lights were on. So part of it was being able to embrace the fact that it was abandoned and let sections fall into darkness and disrepair. And particularly that would be the autopsy room itself. And then the interior of the makeshift morgue part, which is the sort of ice room, that was just using practical lighting and just trying to put it in places that would make sense and still keep our characters shadowed and silhouetted when needed, and give it the appropriate color palette. Always in the back of my mind, although David and I discuss color palette a lot, I mean, it is a GDT Presents show, and so Guillermo's sort of sensibilities through camera and production design and just wandering the offices, and being such a huge fan of his work, those colors are obviously derivative of some of the stuff that he likes.
One of the things that I also really loved about the morgue sequence is the reliance on practical effects over CGI. And of course, the disadvantage of that is sometimes you run the risk of it looking a little cheesy, which was not the case in this. This was horrifying and disgusting, and all of the good things that you would expect out of a sequence like this. So, Taz, tell me about your approach to shooting some of that practical, the makeup and the body pieces and whatnot to kind of maximize that horrible effect.
Well, there's a huge. I mean, it was a long process where everybody was involved. From Miles to production design, FS makeup, lighting, etc. Mostly because we were dealing with wax and molds, and when we dwell on it long enough, they tend to look fake. What works on our side, though, is that very few of the audience, and certainly very few of the crew members, had ever been in a morgue or seen a body or even, see the inside of a body. So that we were allowed some leeway in trying to figure out how to make it gory enough and feel visceral enough. The practical effects of how to hide a body is a classic, woman in a box deal. Every magic show in the world has it, except that we had the added disadvantage of our table, if you were, was slatted, so therefore it wasn't opaque. We could actually see between the slats, and that both led to the believability of it, because we looked underneath the table, and obviously there was no human there. So the way that worked was our alien was literally lying on a table with a dummy body attached to his chest, and there was a chair and whatnot, a lounge for him to lay down on. And then through camera trickery and some CGI, but through camera trickery, we kind of managed to avoid seeing the actor's body.
Yeah, I mean, Guillermo and I have always been fans of practical effects. And, when there was no CGI and you had to do practical, you did the best you could. And you couldn't always do everything that was, in your head and in your dreams. But, I think we generally try to start with practical and then use CGI where we need to, and certainly for the fine brush strokes. I feel like on this episode, there was a lot of anatomy classes about, okay, when you open up that chest, what does it look like? How does a rib cage come apart? What do the organs look like? And we went to the organ market, and I remember, I think at some point we had to go to a butcher shop and just go and get something. I forget what it was. It was
pig heart. We had a pig heart.
I think it was a pig heart. We did not kill the pig, but we went to a butcher, and I guess the guy who was making pork chops had it laying around. So, there was a lot of that, which was interesting. And then, of course, when it comes to, the alien sort of entering his body with all those tentacles, well, there's no way you can do that. So, we really kind of went to school there and used our bullets on that. But I think generally you'll find that our work will have a healthy combination of both, and that we won't rely on CGI, because oftentimes, it looks like what it is, and an audience is sophisticated enough now to know what it is. So that's the goal anyway.
Well, it worked extremely well. It was very disquieting. Nelson, I wanted to ask you, one of my favorite elements of the track of the show is the traveler, and the way he tends to seduce his victims almost like with a kind of a Jedi mind hypnosis kind of treatment with his voice.
It's a secret. Now we're friends, aren't we? Good friends. I mean, you said so, didn't you? Maybe we could be best friends. Knock your beer onto the floor. Be sloppy. Call me your friend. Ask me to drive you home.
Tell us about how you approached that, developing that sound of the traveler's voice, and the effect of him kind of overwhelming his victims that he's seducing.
Yeah, this was something actually we talked about a lot from the early stages, like David and I talked about. And I mean, with anything, he didn't really get into specifics or fill in the blanks for us, but he'd start to draw these references to so many other films, right? And not as a means of knocking them off, but here's what they did in film X or Y to convey this psychological effect, and that's what I'm trying to do. And he had fortunately he's got, I think, an encyclopedic knowledge of films, and particularly in the horror genre. Actually, for this voice, he actually referenced voice work on Creepshow, which was it's a movie I loved as a teenager, and he suggested it as an approach, but certainly not as an end product, but just, hey, this is a rabbit hole you might want to go down. So I suggested right off the bat that we re-record all of Luke Richards' lines at high resolution, right, to give us maximum design playability. And surprisingly, David was all in to ADRing the entire performance, a good performance for an actor. And so we did this marathon session during which we recorded all of the Traveler's lines with a couple of different accents and also as whispers, right? So the versions, we then we pitched and layered the versions, and then I cut whispers to trail the main dialogue, to create a sort of what he says versus what his victim hears effect, if you know what I mean. And our mixer, Mike Warnick, he delayed the whispers further and moved them around the room, to help create a feel of hypnosis. And I personally, I especially like how we use the pitch to change the traveler's character through the autopsy scene. I found it the most interesting there, like more so than in the bar, because he sort of goes from very weak and pathetic when he's down on the floor to menacing and powerful just by using pitch, and then we waver his voice as the scene goes, almost as he's struggling to survive in like the damaged body of his host, right? And David and I we sat down and bent the pitch on specific words and phrases as he called them out. So we'd like watch the scene through and he'd say there, right there. And then we would like bend it and there, that word there, boom. And we would bend it right. And even the effect even surprised me. I was really impressed, I gotta say.
Yeah, I really appreciate you brought that up, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that autopsy sequence and the way you actually used, I felt the way you used Dolby Atmos in the voices was really creative, in that kind of that final tussle, sequence between the two of them. I'd love for you to talk about kind of there are some big Atmos moments in the show, the meteor, going by, but that final kind of conversation between the two of them during the autopsy was, for me, kind of an amazing Atmos moment.
So again, it's always like the most impressive stuff that we seem to do in the least amount of time, because that came together really late in the game because it was such a complex VFX, and I'm not even sure David knew exactly where it was going to go. He had to kind of see it play itself out, and that it needed time to flesh out. Like I'm talking over weeks and weeks and weeks, right? So when it did arrive, we were pretty blown away. Like it's reminiscent of traveling across the landscape of an alien world, right? Like just sort of strafing across the surface of Jupiter or something. There's a lot of organic sounds, liquid rushing, pulsing, air movement, and there's even some animal growls in there. Again, get a lot of mileage out of animal growls. The sounds are pretty unique unto themselves, but they shared a lot of the same frequencies. So we used the room, and you mentioned, Atmos. We had to use the room to play them very selectively so they could sort of stand out on their own. And it was also key in making us feel like we were inside of something huge, like not inside a brain, but inside of a consciousness, right? So the treatment of Winter's voice was ideal. I thought, and I guess the Traveler's voice was treated the same way, but we leaned into it a bit more on Winter's to make him feel like he had the upper hand. And it surprised me because we placed it almost equally in every speaker in the room, and the effect was unbelievably like it was coming from inside you, right? So it was huge gains for relatively little effort on the mix stage. So kudos to those guys for pulling it off.
I'd never really heard anybody use Atmos in that way before. I'm kind of curious, Nelson, from your standpoint, and maybe Miles, this is something that you would want to weigh in on as well. It feels like people are becoming more adventurous in using Atmos in episodic storytelling. And I think that this episode, certainly the autopsy, is a great example of that. Nelson, is that something that you're seeing, that people are willing to kind of have a little bit more fun and use the technology?
Only to the extent that filmmakers are becoming more adventurous, right? Like you can only work with what you're given, in a sense, right? And you need something, like you need a filmmaker like Guillermo or someone like David to be able to present you with that canvas to be able to work with, right? I mean, there's plenty of instances where we're asked to sort of provide an Atmos mix, and it's like, this is a narrative film, and if you lean too hard into it, this just comes off as gimmickry, as something distracting that's over your head or behind you. Being presented with something like this, it's a dream, right? It's a playground. If you really want to work in the immersive medium, it's fantastic. It's all there. I mean, you just have to sort of fill it in a sense, right? So this was a dream. This is probably the heaviest instance that we've ever used Atmos, and to great effect. It's like, how far do you want to go? It's like we just kept going and going, and a lot never seemed like too much.
For my part, I'll say that I think a lot of people now at home have rather sophisticated sound systems, and Netflix is very open to it, even though there's a cost, and certainly the filmmakers. I mean, I don't know if you're doing a Hallmark movie or whatever, but like we're always interested in pushing that envelope and want to make it as good as we can for whatever part of our audience that we can. So ever since I heard jets panning across the top or birds flying across, or however we can do that sort of sophisticated sound design, we're up for that. So we generally at this point, no matter what it is, film or television, are mixing in Atmos because we just want to sort of reach for the top.
The final question for you, Miles. You're the co-showrunner on the show with Guillermo del Toro, who's been on this podcast a couple of times in the past couple of years. So I was very curious to talk with you guys about this show. Every episode is directed by a different filmmaker, and they all have very unique styles, voices, approaches to storytelling. Tell us about your collaboration with Guillermo and how you guided each of your directors through the process of building the show.
Well, that's an interesting question because, in fact, the North Star of this show was to provide a showcase for directors with stories that Guillermo loved, and so we, unlike most of television, where a showrunner who's typically a writer will they'll hire directors and they'll do the show and they'll do their cut and then they're kind of out of it in most cases. Here, we really wanted this to be the director's vision. So in some cases, mostly it started with us identifying what we considered to be underexposed filmmakers. David in particular, The Empty Man was an amazing movie that not a lot of people got a chance to see because the timing of the Fox sale to Disney, it took all the time for the Fox executives, and he didn't get a great release and he didn't get great marketing, but it was a terrific movie and it showed a great vision. So and same with Anna Lilly, same with all the directors. In fact, really, Catherine Hardwicke, I think, by far was the only one who had done, sort of bigger studio movies. And so that was really the genesis of it, is finding those directors that we felt had a voice that needed to be heard, that we could expose to the world, to, generally a far bigger audience, the hundreds of millions of Netflix members, as opposed to most of them had done either indie movies or movies that hadn't been seen, and then give them the reins. So as I said, in many cases, we gave them cinematographers of their choice, as was the case with Toss. We gave all of them the choice of their own composer. We worked with them together on the casting, but we generally, I wouldn't say we left them alone, but we supported them where they needed to be. Generally, the decisions were theirs to make within reason and with our guidance, and all the way from script and sometimes including rewrites, through casting, location selection, production, and all the way through the cut. We were very involved with the cut, obviously, Guillermo and I, and then right down to sound and color. So that was really the mantra, was that it wasn't that we were kind of like hovering over them. We really wanted it to be their vision, all the way from top to bottom, where they could take these individual episodes and 8 beautiful different episodes and be able to expose them their work to the world. So that was 100% the guiding principle of this series.
Yeah, and it sounds like you were just so empowering of the directors. I mean, I was very caught by what Nelson just said a few minutes ago about sitting with David Pryor on the mixing stage and making decisions about, individual lines of dialogue, which is, in episodic television, directors, they're usually not around for the mix. So it sounds like you guys really did an amazing job of supporting them and their vision all the way through to the end, which is, it's an extraordinary thing.
I will say this, making 8 movies at the same time is very difficult. And if there hadn't been that division of labor where somebody is absolutely on top of every single thing, I'm not sure that we could have done it, frankly. And another thing to note, none of the 8 directors asked me one question about any of the other 7 episodes. So it was kind of like, yeah, you mean you don't all work for me all the time? And it's like, no, they've got, Tamara's got to move on to this next show and she can't spend all day on this chair. So it was interesting, but frankly, as proud as we are of this show, I would not advise anybody to do an anthology series because it will not extend your life and it may in fact shorten it.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this conversation. Miles, Nelson, Toss, congratulations on the success of the show. 7 Emmy nominations. It's a great achievement. Congratulations again. And thanks for coming on the Dolby podcast to talk to us about it.
Thank you. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Many thanks once again to Miles, Nelson, and Taz for joining us today. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Netflix for putting this conversation together and for giving us those amazing clips. Be sure to check out Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, now streaming on Netflix in stunning Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. You can find a link, as always, in our show notes. If you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This is the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. Thanks for joining us.